My parents changed the locks on my home while I was in the middle of a corporate audit. My father sent a single text message that read, "Your room belongs to your sister now. Come get your belongings from the front lawn." I was 35 years old, paying him $1,500 a month in rent, and treated like a squatter in my own family. I did not call. I did not beg. I drove straight to the Fulton County Courthouse. By Friday, a sheriff was standing on his pristine porch with legal papers that made their blood run cold. If you have ever been pushed out by the people who were supposed to protect you, stay with me. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button to see exactly how I dismantled their perfect lives. I was sitting in my downtown Atlanta office surrounded by stacks of financial records for a major audit when my phone vibrated against my mahogany desk. I glanced at the screen, expecting a message from my legal team regarding a pending corporate merger. Instead, it was a text from my father, Calvin. The words on the screen made my pulse slow to a steady, calculated crawl. "Your room is Jada's now. Julian's startup needs a transition period. Come get your stuff from the lawn. Locks are changed." I did not cry. I did not throw my phone or call him demanding an explanation. Working as a forensic accountant teaches you to detach emotion from the facts, and the fact was, my own father had just illegally evicted me without a second thought. I calmly closed my laptop, packed my leather briefcase, and took the elevator down to the parking garage. The drive to the sprawling family estate in Buckhead took exactly 40 minutes, giving me plenty of time to process the sheer audacity of what was happening. When I pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the property, the reality of my family's betrayal was displayed across the manicured grass. My custom designer suits, my vintage vinyl collection, and boxes of my confidential work documents were stuffed carelessly into heavy-duty black trash bags, baking in the relentless Georgia sun. Sitting on the wraparound porch, sipping sweet tea like they were posing for a Southern lifestyle magazine, were my younger sister Jada and her white husband Julian. Jada had always been the golden child, the pageant queen who could do no wrong, while I was the quiet numbers girl who fixed everyone's tax problems and paid the bills. Now she was lounging in a wicker chair, adjusting her designer sunglasses and refusing to even meet my eyes. Julian, however, sauntered down the steps with a smug, self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and tossed it onto the grass next to my ruined belongings. "For a U-Haul, Zuri," Julian said, crossing his arms over his expensive polo shirt. "We really need the space. Family comes first, you know." I looked at the $100 bill fluttering against a black trash bag, then up at Julian. "I have been paying Calvin $1,500 a month for the renovated guest suite," I said, my voice perfectly level. "That makes me a legal tenant." Julian let out a condescending chuckle, shaking his head as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Actually, Zuri, as a tenant at will without a formalized lease agreement, you really do not have any property rights here. It is Calvin's house. He can ask you to leave whenever he wants. You should be grateful he let you crash here as long as you did." Julian was mansplaining real estate law to a woman who audited commercial property firms for a living. He stood there completely dismissing the thousands of dollars I had poured into that guest suite, treating me like a desperate squatter who had overstayed her welcome. Jada finally spoke up from the porch, examining her perfectly manicured nails. "Do not make this harder than it has to be, Zuri. Julian's tech startup is entering a crucial transition phase, and he needs a proper home office. You have a good job. You can just go rent an apartment downtown like a normal single woman." Before I could respond to my sister's blatant entitlement, the heavy mahogany front door opened, and my mother Brenda stepped out. She was wearing her Sunday church clothes, looking every bit the respected matriarch of our community. She walked to the edge of the porch and looked down at me with an expression of weary disappointment, the same look she gave me whenever I failed to live up to her impossible standards. "Do not make a scene on the front lawn." "Zuri," Brenda scolded, her voice hushed but sharp with warning. "The neighbors can hear you. Just take your things and go quietly. Be a good sister for once in your life. Julian is bringing generational wealth into this family, and we need to support his vision. You have always been so selfish with your money." I looked at my mother, the woman who had happily deposited my $1,500 rent checks every month, while praising Julian's imaginary wealth. I looked at Jada, who had never worked a day in her life, but felt entitled to everything I built. And I looked at Julian, who thought he had just outsmarted me with his unearned confidence. I did not scream. I did not pick up the trash bags scattered across the yard. I simply picked up my leather briefcase from the hood of my car and offered them a cold, hollow smile. "Keep the bags," I said, my voice cutting through the humid Atlanta air like shattered glass. "You are going to need them to pack." I turned my back on their confused faces, got into my car, and drove away from the estate. I did not drive to a friend's house to cry. I drove straight to the Fulton County Courthouse. The heat inside my car was stifling, but my hands gripping the leather steering wheel were ice cold. I bypassed the interstate and took the back road straight into downtown Atlanta. The transition from the sprawling green lawns of my family estate in Buckhead to the towering concrete reality of the Fulton County Courthouse felt entirely appropriate. I pulled into the underground parking deck, killed the engine, and popped the glove compartment. I reached past the car manual and pulled out a pristine sealed folder. The silver embossed letters on the front caught the dim parking garage light. Apex Holdings, LLC. My grandfather always told me to build a financial fortress no one could see. Today, I was pulling up the drawbridge. I grabbed my briefcase and walked purposefully toward the courthouse entrance. The security guard waved me through the metal detector. As I placed my bag on the conveyor belt, I could almost hear my mother's voice echoing in my head from last Thanksgiving. She had told her church friends I was just a glorified human calculator. For a decade, I was the one sitting at their dining room table until 2 in the morning, fixing their botched tax returns. I was the one untangling the disastrous commercial investments my father made whenever his ego outpaced his wallet. They happily relied on my forensic accounting skills to save them from massive IRS audits and public bankruptcy. Yet at every single family gathering, my career was dismissed as boring desk work. Julian, on the other hand, was paraded around as the innovative tech genius. He threw around buzzwords like disruption and synergy, producing absolutely nothing of measurable value while they worshipped his potential. They fed on my reality to fund his illusion. I stepped out of the elevator on the 3rd floor. The hallway was packed with angry landlords and weeping tenants holding crumpled eviction notices. I did not take a number. I bypassed the general queue and walked directly to the commercial real estate and emergency injunction window. A clerk with tired eyes and a name tag that read, Denise, looked up from her dual monitors. She opened her mouth to tell me to step back and wait my turn, but I immediately slid my state-certified accounting credentials, my corporate identification, and the Apex Holdings folder across the counter. Denise opened the folder. I watched her eyes scan the crisp pages. She typed a parcel identification number into her database. Her screen reflected the property records for the exact estate my parents were currently sitting in. Her eyebrows shot up. She looked at me, realizing I was not a distressed squatter pleading for extra time. I was the sole managing member of the holding company that legally owned the property down to the very grass my trash bags were currently sitting on. I slid 2 newly drafted forms across the marble counter. I had filled them out in my car using my laptop before walking inside. The first was a formal notice to quit. The second was an emergency injunction for an illegal lockout. Julian had smugly quoted tenant at will laws to me on the lawn, entirely missing the crucial fact that Calvin was not the landlord. 5 years ago, when my father was days away from a public bank foreclosure that would have ruined his standing in the community, Apex Holdings bought the house in a quiet short sale. I was Apex Holdings. I let them stay in the main house. I paid them $1,500 a month in fake rent just to help them save face and rebuild their savings without bruising my father's fragile ego. They took my silent charity and used it to throw me out on the street to make room for a man who had never paid a real bill in his life. Denise reviewed the injunction. She asked if I was absolutely sure I wanted to file a commercial lockout order against my own parents. I looked her dead in the eye and told her I was filing against unauthorized occupants who had unlawfully seized a corporate asset. She nodded, her professional demeanor returning instantly. She informed me that the standard processing time for the civil sheriff to serve the papers was 3 to 5 business days. I pulled out my sleek metal corporate credit card and placed it firmly on the desk. I told her I was requesting the premium expedited service. I wanted them served immediately. I needed the Fulton County Sheriff on their front porch before their fancy welcome dinner tomorrow night. Denise processed the transaction without another word. The receipt printer buzzed loudly in the quiet office, printing out the confirmation of the strike. She gathered the stack of documents, aligned the edges perfectly, and brought down a heavy red stamp on the manila folder. The loud thud echoed against the marble walls. The trap was officially set. Friday evening arrived with the stifling humidity typical of an Atlanta summer. I parked my car a block down from the estate. The street was lined with luxury vehicles. Valets in crisp white shirts were jogging back and forth, opening doors for the wealthiest doctors, lawyers, and church elders in our community. My parents were hosting a lavish welcome home dinner for Jada and Julian. It was their way of cementing Julian as the new heir apparent to a dynasty he had absolutely no part in building. I stepped out of my car wearing a sharp navy blue suit. I had not come to celebrate. I had come to collect. I walked straight through the open wrought iron front gates. The sheer audacity of their setup was breathtaking. A string quartet played softly in the corner of the sprawling patio. Waitstaff carried silver trays of crab-stuffed mushrooms and expensive champagne. Calvin and Brenda were putting on the performance of a lifetime. They were selling the illusion of a flawless, wealthy family to people who had no idea their hosts were financially underwater. I bypassed the valet stand and stepped onto the limestone patio, ignoring the questioning looks from the hired security. Calvin spotted me almost immediately. His practiced smile vanished. He abruptly excused himself from a conversation with Deacon Hayes and marched toward me. His face was a mask of barely contained rage. He grabbed my elbow, his grip tight and warning, trying to physically steer me toward the side garden path hidden from the guests. He hissed under his breath, demanding to know what I was doing here and telling me I was ruining Jada's night. I looked down at his hand on my arm until he realized I was not going to move a single inch. He slowly let go. I smoothed out the sleeve of my jacket and told him I had every right to be here. I reminded him that I paid the caterers standing behind him just 3 weeks ago when his credit card was declined. Before Calvin could come up with a response, Brenda noticed the commotion. She practically sprinted across the patio, a crystal wine glass clutched in her hand. She plastered a deeply fake, sympathetic smile on her face as she approached. Pastor Miller and his wife, Sister Thomas, were standing just a few feet away, watching the interaction with thinly veiled curiosity. Brenda knew exactly how to play to her audience. She leaned in close to Sister Thomas and delivered a loud, theatrical whisper. She claimed I was just going through a bitter phase because I was single and 35. She said seeing my younger sister so happily married to a successful tech executive was bringing out my jealousy. She asked the pastor's wife to pray for my hardened heart. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. Forensic accountants do not waste energy on screaming matches. We wait for the numbers to do the talking. I simply stared at my mother, admiring her commitment to a completely fabricated reality. Jada and Julian noticed the tension and walked over to join the circle. Jada was clinging tightly to Julian's arm, wearing a designer silk dress that I recognized immediately. She had bought it using my department store account 2 months ago, claiming it was a necessary expense for Julian's business meetings. Julian looked at me with that same smug, self-satisfied expression he wore on the lawn. He adjusted his expensive watch and sighed loudly. He told me to go around to the kitchen, grab a plate of food from the staff, and quietly leave before I embarrassed the family any further. He actually patted Calvin on the shoulder, playing the role of the benevolent, wealthy son-in-law, protecting the family estate from a troubled relative. I smiled. It was a cold, empty smile. I told Julian I was not hungry, and I certainly was not leaving. Calvin took a step forward, puffing out his chest, ready to physically throw me off the patio. He opened his mouth to shout an order at the private security guard standing by the gate. He never got the chance. Heavy, authoritative knocks echoed from the massive custom mahogany front doors of the estate. The sound was so loud and demanding that the chatter on the patio instantly died down. The string quartet stopped playing mid-measure. Guests turned their heads, their champagne glasses frozen in the air. Calvin frowned, visibly annoyed by the interruption to his perfect high society dinner. He gestured sharply to one of the hired waitstaff to go open the door and handle whoever was interrupting his event. The waitstaff did not need to open the door. It swung open forcefully. Two Fulton County Sheriff's deputies stepped into the grand foyer, their heavy-duty boots clicking loudly against the imported marble floors. Their presence completely shattered the elegant atmosphere. Calvin quickly rearranged his features into his best welcoming smile. He smoothed his suit jacket and walked briskly toward the deputies, extending his hand in a gesture of false authority. He assumed they were here to escort me off the property. He told the deputies he was glad they arrived, pointing back at me and claiming he had an unwanted trespasser causing a disturbance at his private residence. The deputies did not shake his hand. They did not even look in my direction. The lead deputy, a tall man with a completely unamused expression, bypassed Calvin entirely and walked straight into the center of the dining room. He unclipped a thick stack of legal documents from his clipboard. The lead deputy stepped squarely into the center of the grand dining room, his heavy-duty boots leaving faint scuff marks on the imported marble floors. He held out the thick stack of legal documents. He did not hand them to me. He extended them directly toward my father's chest. Calvin stared at the manila folder as if it were a venomous snake. He refused to raise his hands to take it. Instead, he let out a booming, forced belly laugh. It was the exact same laugh he used at corporate board meetings when a subordinate presented a flaw in his logic. He turned to the affluent neighbors and church elders gathered around the patio, waving his hand dismissively in my direction. He announced to the crowd that his oldest daughter was simply throwing a petty, jealous tantrum over some misplaced luggage. He told Dr. Vance, a respected surgeon in our community, that I had always been desperate for attention whenever Jada was in the spotlight. He claimed I was wasting taxpayer dollars to have the sheriff escort me to my car, acting like a bitter spinster, trying to ruin a joyous family celebration. Brenda immediately seized the opportunity to control the narrative. She stepped close to the pastor's wife, her voice carrying across the silent room in a theatrical whisper. She claimed they had tried everything to help me find a husband and secure a normal life, framing my arrival with law enforcement as a tragic emotional breakdown rather than a calculated legal strike. Julian, fueled by his own massive ego, decided to intervene. He stepped in front of Calvin, crossing his arms over his expensive tailored suit. He flashed a condescending smile at the deputies and told them there had been a simple misunderstanding regarding a tenant-at-will arrangement. He used convoluted real estate jargon he clearly did not understand, attempting to sound like a seasoned corporate attorney. He told the officers they were free to go, assuring them that the family would handle my little outburst internally. The deputy did not share their amusement. He did not step back. He stepped closer, invading Calvin's personal space, forcing my father to either take the papers or let them fall to the floor. Calvin reflexively grabbed the stack. The deputy then pulled a second identical folder from his clipboard and shoved it firmly against Julian's chest. "Sir!" The deputy's voice boomed through the dead silent room, entirely devoid of emotion. "You are being served with a 7-day notice to vacate for the illegal lockout of the recognized property owner Apex Holdings, LLC. You are also served with an emergency injunction prohibiting the removal, sale, or destruction of any property on these premises." Calvin's manufactured smile vanished instantly. The color drained from his face as his eyes darted across the bold legal print bearing the seal of the Fulton County judge. Brenda dropped her crystal wine glass. It shattered violently against the patio stones, splashing expensive Chardonnay across Julian's imported leather loafers. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. The church elders exchanged wide-eyed glances. Dr. Vance took a slow, deliberate step back from my father, instinctively distancing himself from the sudden legal toxicity. Julian, however, recovered his arrogance in record time. He let out a loud scoff, aggressively shaking his head as he flipped through the first few pages of the injunction. He turned toward the crowd, clearly eager to humiliate me and re-establish his position as the smartest man in the room. He loudly declared that the papers meant absolutely nothing. He puffed out his chest, explaining to the bewildered guests that he had already run a background check on the property deed before investing in his transition. He smirked at the deputies, stating that Apex Holdings was nothing more than a faceless corporate shell company hiding behind a registered agent. Then Julian turned his aggressive gaze directly toward me. He pointed a manicured finger in my direction and announced to the entire room that he held a fully executed commercial lease for the guest house signed directly by the property owner, Calvin. He boasted that his lease granted him ironclad commercial tenant protections under Georgia law. He told the crowd that this eviction notice was just a piece of useless paper filed by an ignorant, glorified bookkeeper who did not understand how real business worked. I let his smug, misinformed monologue echo across the patio. I watched the triumphant, cruel smile spread across Jada's face as she clung to her husband's arm. I watched Brenda breathe a heavy sigh of relief, fully trusting her white son-in-law to magically fix the mess with his unearned confidence. They all looked at me, expecting me to shrink away in defeat. Instead, I took 2 measured steps into the center of the room. The acoustics of the grand foyer carried my voice perfectly. Calvin does not own this house, Julian. I stated my words, cutting through the humid night air with absolute surgical precision. I watched my father physically flinch as if I had struck him across the face. His posture crumpled. He lost the deed to the bank 5 years ago when his manufacturing firm faced public bankruptcy. I continued, ensuring every single affluent guest heard the truth. Apex Holdings bought the debt in a private short sale to keep this family from being thrown out onto the street. I was the one who structured the buyout while you were all attending galas. I looked directly into Julian's eyes, stripping away every ounce of his false authority. I am the sole managing member of Apex Holdings. Your lease is entirely fraudulent because it was signed by a man who does not own a single brick of this estate. I pulled my car keys from my blazer pocket and held his panicked gaze. You have exactly 7 days to get off my property. The weekend passed in total silence, the kind of silence that only happens when guilty people are scrambling to cover their tracks. By Monday morning, I was back at my mahogany desk in downtown Atlanta, reviewing quarterly projections for a corporate client when my private line rang. It was Terrence, my lead corporate litigator. He did not bother with pleasantries. He told me Calvin and Julian had just filed an emergency injunction of their own at the Fulton County Clerk's office right when the doors opened at 8 o'clock. They were attempting to halt the 7-day notice to vacate. Terrence sounded irritated but entirely unsurprised. He explained that Julian had managed to find a strip mall lawyer willing to file a desperate countersuit claiming unlawful interference with a commercial enterprise. Before Terrence could even finish his sentence, a notification pinged on my computer screen. It was an email marked with high importance. The sender was Julian, and he had explicitly copied his bargain bin lawyer, Terrence and Calvin. I opened the message. The sheer arrogance radiating from the screen was almost impressive. Zuri, the email began, completely ignoring any standard professional greeting. While the family certainly appreciates your cute attempt at playing real estate mogul this weekend, you are entirely out of your depth. I am not a tenant at will. I am the founder and CEO of a registered technology firm. Calvin and I executed a legally binding 5-year commercial lease for the guest estate over a month ago. Furthermore, I transferred a $50,000 security and improvement deposit directly into Calvin's accounts to secure my status as a protected commercial tenant under Georgia state law. Your fraudulent eviction notice is not only baseless, it is actionable harassment. Back off, go back to your spreadsheets, and let the adults handle the family business. I read the words twice, letting the absolute delusion of his claims wash over me. Julian genuinely believed he could outmaneuver a forensic accountant with a fake lease and a phantom deposit. Terrence was still on speakerphone, listening to me read the email aloud. He warned me that if Julian could produce a signed 5-year commercial lease and a cleared $50,000 bank wire, the eviction process would stall. Georgia courts treat commercial tenant protections incredibly seriously, especially when significant capital improvements are involved. A judge would likely grant an automatic stay, dragging the eviction out for months in civil litigation. Terrence asked if there was any possibility that Julian actually had $50,000 to give my father. I did not argue. I did not scream in frustration. I actually smiled, leaning back in my leather ergonomic chair. I told Terrence not to worry about drafting a formal response just yet. I told him to give me exactly 2 hours. I disconnected the call and closed my email client. I opened my specialized forensic accounting suite. Julian wanted to play a game of numbers with someone who dismantled fraudulent corporate empires for a living. He had just handed me the exact rope I needed to hang them both. A $50,000 transaction leaves a massive digital footprint. Money does not simply materialize out of thin air, especially not in Calvin's world. My father's bank accounts had been on life support for half a decade. I knew this because I had been the one silently monitoring the primary family trust to ensure the mortgage on the main house did not default. If Julian had actually wired $50,000 to Calvin, there would be an origin point, a routing sequence, and a clearinghouse record. I started with Apex Holdings. As the recognized property owner, any legitimate commercial lease deposit would legally have to be placed into an escrow account under the holding company's name. I checked the corporate ledgers. The balance was exactly where I left it. 0 unauthorized deposits. 0 commercial lease agreements registered. Next, I shifted my focus to Calvin's personal accounts. Using the authorized access he had gladly granted me years ago to handle his massive tax liabilities, I pulled his transaction history for the past 90 days. I filtered the incoming wire transfers. There was no $50,000 deposit from Julian. There was no $50,000 deposit from anyone. Calvin's primary checking account currently held a little over $1,200. I sat forward, my eyes scanning the digital rows of data. Julian was a liar, but he was a specific kind of liar. He was the type of tech bro who believed that creating a paper trail was the same as creating reality. If he submitted a sworn affidavit to a judge claiming a deposit was made, he had to attach a receipt. He had to have fabricated a wire transfer confirmation, or worse, he and Calvin had shuffled money around to create the illusion of a cleared transaction. I ran a reverse search on Julian's startup, utilizing state corporate registry databases. His company was registered to a virtual mail drop in Delaware. He had 0 active payroll, 0 registered patents, and 0 institutional venture capital backing. His entire company was a cheap landing page and a fabricated valuation. He did not have $50,000 to his name. But then a glaring anomaly caught my eye on Calvin's secondary credit line. A massive sudden withdrawal of exactly $50,000 had been executed late Sunday night. It was a cash advance pulled against the remaining equity of Brenda's life insurance policy, a policy I had specifically structured to protect her. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. Julian had not paid my father a single dime. Calvin had panicked after the sheriff showed up on Friday night. Desperate to maintain the illusion of Julian's wealth and desperate to manufacture a defense against my eviction, Calvin had drained his own wife's final safety net. He took a predatory cash advance against Brenda's policy, routing it through Julian's shell company just so Julian could wire it right back to him this morning to generate a fake commercial deposit receipt. They had committed wire fraud and financial perjury, and they had documented the entire conspiracy on federal banking servers. I took a slow sip of my espresso. My smile widened. Julian thought he was protected by a commercial lease. He had absolutely no idea he had just handed me the exact evidence I needed to send them both to federal prison. I exported the banking logs, compiled the routing data into an encrypted file, and drafted a new email. I addressed it to Terrence, attached the irrefutable evidence of their financial crimes, and wrote a single line of text: checkmate. Sending that email to Terrence was satisfying, but a true forensic auditor knows that a single anomaly is rarely an isolated event. It is usually the glaring symptom of a much deeper systemic infection. Julian had foolishly challenged me. He told me to go back to my spreadsheets and let the adults handle the business. I decided to take his advice to the absolute extreme. I opened a new instance of my tracking software, cracking my knuckles as I set the parameters to isolate every digital footprint associated with Julian's name and his so-called technology firm. Bypassing the basic privacy firewalls of his Delaware-registered shell company was effortless. When the operating ledgers for his startup populated across my dual monitors, the sheer scale of his financial incompetence was breathtaking. Julian's company was entirely legally and fundamentally bankrupt. He had managed to secure a moderate round of seed funding from 3 minor angel investors roughly 8 months ago. But the outgoing wire transfers from the corporate account had absolutely nothing to do with software development, payroll, or server costs. Instead, the digital trail mapped perfectly onto Jada's social media feed. I watched the data flow from investor capital directly into luxury retail accounts. A $12,000 wire to a designer boutique in Milan matched the exact date Jada posted a photo of her new limited edition handbag. A recurring $4,000 monthly transfer went straight to an exotic car dealership to cover the lease on Julian's sports car. He was treating his investors' capital as a personal slush fund to finance my sister's illusion of a high society lifestyle. I pulled up the $50,000 deposit receipt Julian had submitted to the Fulton County Court as proof of his commercial lease. Subjecting the PDF to a basic metadata scrub revealed exactly what I expected. The document was a complete forgery, stitched together in Photoshop just hours after the sheriff deputies left the estate. Julian had never paid my father a single dime for rent. But as I dug deeper into the cross-referenced accounts between the two men, the reality of my father's desperation became undeniably clear. The financial flow was moving in the exact opposite direction. Calvin was not collecting rent. Calvin was aggressively bailing Julian out. Beyond draining my mother's life insurance policy, I uncovered another terrifying set of transactions buried in Calvin's financial history. Just 3 weeks ago, my father had authorized a massive predatory loan against his own severely dwindling retirement account. The interest rate attached to the loan was borderline extortion, the kind of financial suicide people only commit when they are out of options. The entirety of that cash advance had been quietly funneled directly into Julian's failing corporate account to cover a bounced vendor check. My father was willingly bleeding his own future dry. He was destroying decades of his own labor just to protect his white son-in-law from facing the consequences of embezzlement. He was funding their fraud just to maintain the aesthetic of generational wealth for the neighbors. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the monitors reflecting off my face in the dark office. A critical question remained. Julian had burned through the seed capital. Calvin had maxed out the life insurance and the retirement accounts. The money was completely gone. So how exactly were they planning to survive the month? I accessed my mother's synchronized digital family calendar. I still had back-end administrative access from the years I spent managing their complex social schedules. I scrolled to the upcoming weekend, and a blocked-out event immediately caught my eye. Buckhead Community Charity Gala, hosted by Calvin and Brenda Wilson. I clicked on the event details and downloaded the digital invitation list. They had invited every affluent neighbor, every church elder, and every local business owner in their social circle. But it was the attachment at the bottom of the invitation that made my blood run cold. It was a routing instruction sheet for charitable donations. I ran the routing number through my software. The beneficiary account did not belong to a registered charity. It fed directly into the primary operating account of Julian's bankrupt tech startup. The gala was a front. Calvin and Brenda were not hosting a charity event. They were hosting a desperate, unregulated solicitation ring. They were planning to use their standing in the church and the local community to trick their wealthy friends into making tax-deductible donations. They intended to use the congregation's money to quietly replace the funds Julian had embezzled before his original seed investors demanded an audit. My parents were willing to commit federal wire fraud against their own friends just to keep Julian out of prison and keep Jada in designer shoes. I slowly closed the calendar application. The 7-day eviction notice was merely a warning shot. They thought they were fighting a simple real estate battle over a guest house. They had no idea I was currently holding the digital blueprints to their entire criminal conspiracy. I reached for my phone and dialed Terrence. He answered on the first ring. I told him to cancel the motion to expedite the eviction hearing. I wanted to give them the weekend. I wanted Calvin, Brenda, Jada, and Julian to put on their best formal wear. I wanted them to gather every important wealthy person they knew into the main ballroom of my estate. I was going to let them set the perfect stage before I burned their house of cards to the ground. The Buckhead night sky was a deep, bruised purple by the time I pulled up to the service entrance of the estate. I did not bother with the valet. I parked my car near the caterer's transport vans lining the private access road. As the sole managing member of Apex Holdings and the legal owner of the property, I possessed the master override code for the service gates. I punched in the numbers, waited for the heavy iron to swing open, and slipped onto the manicured grounds completely undetected. The main lawn had been transformed into a breathtaking spectacle of southern wealth. A massive white pavilion tent was strung with thousands of warm fairy lights. A live jazz band played smoothly from a raised mahogany platform. Waiters in crisp black and white uniforms circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays of seared scallops, Wagyu beef sliders, and top-tier bourbon. Calvin and Brenda had spared absolutely no expense, likely putting the entire catering bill on a high-interest credit card they had absolutely no intention or ability to pay off. I grabbed a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and blended into the periphery of the party. From the shadows of the towering azalea bushes, I watched the sickening performance unfold. Jada was holding court near a massive custom-carved ice sculpture. She was dripping in diamonds that caught the pavilion lighting with every arrogant toss of her head. I knew exactly whose money had purchased those stones. It was the seed capital Julian had embezzled from his initial naive investors. Jada paraded Julian around the lawn like a prized show pony, eagerly introducing him to the most affluent and influential members of our community. The racial and social dynamics at play made my stomach turn. Calvin and Brenda had spent 40 years meticulously building their reputation among Atlanta's black elite. They sat on local charity boards. They were pillars of their prestigious church. They belonged to the most exclusive historically black fraternities and sororities. And now they were actively weaponizing that hard-earned trust. They were utilizing their cultural and social standing to legitimize Julian. They were serving up their own friends, their lifelong mentors, and their community leaders to a white con artist with a bankrupt shell company, all to maintain the fragile, desperate illusion of their daughter's perfect marriage and their own financial supremacy. I watched my father clap Deacon Hayes on the back, smoothly steering the older man toward Julian's sleek display table. Julian stood in front of an expensive, professionally printed banner displaying his company's logo. He was aggressively tossing out meaningless buzzwords about artificial intelligence algorithm integration and market disruption. He was selling snake oil, and my parents were eagerly holding the bottle. They were completely willing to bankrupt the people they shared pews with every Sunday, just to keep up appearances and cover their own tracks. For a decade, I was the one who worked late into the night to protect my father's reputation. When his commercial investments tanked, I restructured the debt. When the bank came knocking with foreclosure papers, I bought the house through Apex Holdings to keep the community from witnessing his failure. I protected the family name with my sweat and my expertise. Now Calvin was using that same respected name to run a massive, unregulated financial solicitation ring right on my front lawn. I moved quietly through the elegant crowd, remaining out of their direct line of sight while listening to snippets of conversation. Brenda was whispering to a group of her wealthy sorority sisters, casually dropping massively inflated numbers about Julian's projected corporate valuation. She was framing the charitable aspect of the gala as an exclusive friends and family opportunity to get in on the ground floor of the next Silicon Valley unicorn. It was a classic, devastating affinity fraud. They were preying on the inherent trust of their own people, leveraging black excellence to fund white mediocrity. Then I saw him, Dr. Arthur Vance. Dr. Vance was not just another wealthy neighbor looking to increase his portfolio. He was a highly respected pediatric surgeon, a dedicated community leader who had personally funded full college scholarships for underprivileged youth across the city, and a man who had known our family since I was in middle school. He was a genuinely good man who trusted my father implicitly. Dr. Vance was standing near the edge of the limestone patio, isolated from the main crowd. Julian had him backed into a corner. Julian was leaning in, employing that aggressive, overly familiar sales tactic he clearly mistook for charm and charisma. Jada stood right next to him, nodding enthusiastically and flashing her diamond tennis bracelet to reinforce the illusion of massive success. Calvin hovered just behind them, playing the role of the proud, benevolent patriarch, endorsing the lucrative deal. I edged closer, slipping behind a towering floral arrangement of white orchids. I could hear Julian's voice, slick, fast, and brimming with unearned confidence. He was telling Dr. Vance that they were officially closing the seed funding round by midnight. He claimed that major institutional investors in California were practically begging for the remaining shares, but Calvin had insisted on keeping a portion open for the local community. It was a textbook high-pressure sales tactic. Julian firmly promised Dr. Vance that his capital would go directly toward scaling the software infrastructure and hiring top-tier engineers. I knew the only thing that capital would scale was Julian's luxury car lease and Jada's designer wardrobe. Dr. Vance looked thoughtful. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and nodded slowly. He looked at Calvin and told him that any son-in-law of the Wilson family was a friend of the community. He said he believed in supporting young, innovative minds and helping build generational wealth. I watched in slow motion as Dr. Vance reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound checkbook. He retrieved a heavy gold fountain pen. He opened the checkbook and flattened it against the surface of a high-top cocktail table. Julian's eyes locked onto the crisp paper, a flash of pure predatory greed illuminating his face. Julian leaned forward smoothly, instructing Dr. Vance to make the check out directly to the corporate operating account. He casually mentioned that a $100,000 commitment would secure a premium equity position and an advisory board seat. Dr. Vance uncapped the gold fountain pen, resting the sharp nib against the pristine paper line, ready to sign away $100,000 of hard-earned money to a bankrupt fraudster. I stepped out from behind the floral arrangement and walked directly into their circle. I stepped out from the shadow of the towering white orchids. The heels of my shoes clicked sharply against the imported limestone patio, cutting a deliberate rhythm through the soft jazz playing in the background. Brenda saw me before the others did. The polished, gracious hostess smile melted off her face, instantly replaced by a mask of sheer panic. She lunged forward, moving faster than a woman in a restrictive designer gown should be capable of. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin. She pulled me aggressively toward the catering tents, her voice a venomous, panicked hiss. She told me to get back to the kitchen immediately. She demanded I stop embarrassing the family in front of the elders. She loudly whispered that I was clearly unstable, that I was ruining Jada's big night because I could not handle my own miserable life. I did not pull away violently. I simply stopped walking. I looked down at her hand gripping my sleeve, then up into her eyes, letting the cold reality of my presence freeze her in place. I smoothly twisted my arm out of her grip and sidestepped her entirely, leaving her stumbling slightly in her high heels. I walked directly to the high-top cocktail table where Dr. Vance had his gold fountain pen poised over his checkbook. Julian's eyes widened. Calvin opened his mouth to shout a command. Before either of them could utter a single syllable, I reached into my leather portfolio. I pulled out a sleek black dossier and slid it directly onto the table, covering Dr. Vance's checkbook completely. "Before you write that check, Doctor," I said, projecting my voice perfectly so it carried over the music and the surrounding tables. "You might want to look at the Chapter 7 bankruptcy filing Julian submitted in Delaware last Tuesday." The jazz band seemed to miss a beat. The clinking of champagne glasses in our immediate vicinity stopped entirely. Dr. Vance looked up at me, his pen freezing in midair. He had known me since I was 12 years old. He knew I was the quiet, analytical daughter who fixed Calvin's financial messes, not the one who created public scenes. Julian reacted first. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson. He slammed his hand down on the dossier, attempting to drag it off the table and out of sight. He let out a high-pitched, frantic laugh. He told Dr. Vance not to listen to a word I said. He claimed I was a disgruntled former tenant, an unstable accountant who had just been legally evicted for failing to pay rent. He aggressively insisted the documents were fabricated nonsense from a bitter, jealous sister trying to sabotage his tech firm. Calvin immediately jumped in to back his golden son-in-law. He stepped between me and Dr. Vance, his chest puffed out in a classic display of patriarchal intimidation. He apologized profusely to the doctor, claiming I was having a severe mental health crisis because my own career had stalled while Jada was thriving. He waved his hand frantically, ordering the private security guard standing near the buffet to escort me off the premises immediately. I stood my ground. I did not raise my voice. I looked past my father's broad shoulders directly at Dr. Vance. I told him to open the folder. I asked him if a successful Silicon Valley CEO preparing for a massive software launch would need to embezzle his seed money to lease a luxury sports car. Dr. Vance ignored Calvin's blustering entirely. He moved Julian's hand aside with a firm, authoritative gesture and flipped open the black folder. The first page was the official federal bankruptcy filing bearing the federal court watermark. The second page was my forensic breakdown of Julian's corporate accounts. I did not wait for the doctor to process the raw data. I narrated the numbers for the growing crowd gathering around us. I pointed directly at Jada, who was shrinking back against the melting ice sculpture. I announced that the stunning diamond tennis bracelet currently sparkling on her wrist was purchased with the exact same seed capital Julian had secured from his first 3 naive investors. I detailed the wire transfers matching the precise dates of his corporate withdrawals to her luxury retail receipts in Milan. Brenda grabbed my arm again, her voice trembling with desperation. She loudly declared to the watching neighbors that I was a liar. She claimed Julian was bringing generational wealth into our community and that I was trying to destroy Black excellence because I could not find a successful man of my own. She looked around at her affluent sorority sisters, pleading with them to ignore my supposed jealousy. I turned to face my mother, my voice dropping to a deadly clinical calm. I asked her if protecting Black excellence included Calvin taking out a predatory payday loan against his own severely depleted retirement account just to cover a bounced check for Julian's fake company. The collective gasp from the surrounding tables was audible. Calvin stepped back as if he had been physically struck, the remaining color draining from his face. Dr. Vance looked up from the dossier, his expression shifting from confusion to profound, disgusted disappointment. He looked at Calvin, a man he had called a friend and a brother in the church for 2 decades. I was not finished. I turned to address the entire patio. I told Dr. Vance and the listening crowd that this lavish charity gala was nothing more than a desperate front. I instructed them to look at the routing numbers printed on the bottom of their donation cards. I explained that those routing numbers did not lead to a community outreach program or a local youth scholarship fund. They fed directly into Julian's personal bankrupt slush fund. I laid bare the ultimate betrayal. I exposed the fact that my parents were willingly utilizing the deep trust of their church and their lifelong friends to run an unregulated solicitation ring. They were feeding their own people to a white con artist, perfectly willing to bankrupt the community, just to keep up the illusion of Jada's flawless life and cover their own massive debts. Dr. Vance did not say a word at first. He lowered his gold fountain pen and picked up the black folder I had slid over his checkbook. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the crisp official federal bankruptcy filing. I watched the progression of his understanding play out in real time. The initial confusion morphed into shock and then quickly hardened into an icy, profound disgust. He looked at the itemized forensic breakdown of Julian's corporate accounts, tracing the lines of stolen seed capital that led directly to Jada's designer wardrobe. He looked up, bypassing Julian entirely, and locked eyes with my father. The silence between the two men was heavier than any shout could have been. Dr. Vance had trusted Calvin. He had trusted the supposed integrity of the Wilson family name. Slowly, with deliberate and agonizing precision, Dr. Vance picked up his checkbook. He ripped the partially written $100,000 check from the binding. He tore it in half, then into quarters, and let the pieces flutter onto the pristine white tablecloth. He turned his back on my father and walked off the limestone patio without uttering a single syllable. The sudden departure of Atlanta's most respected pediatric surgeon sent an immediate shockwave through the crowd. The murmurs rolling across the lawn morphed into urgent, angry questions. Several other affluent guests who had been hovering near Julian's display table surged forward. They had their own checkbooks out ready to invest in the next big Silicon Valley unicorn, and now they demanded to know exactly what was inside that black folder. Jada snapped. The poised, elegant socialite facade vanished, replaced by the vicious, entitled bully I had grown up with. She shoved her way to the front of the table, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the pavilion lights as she pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. She screamed that I was a liar. Her voice echoed across the lawn, silencing the jazz band completely. She told the surrounding crowd that I was just a bitter, lonely spinster who was obsessed with ruining her perfect marriage. She claimed I was fabricating financial documents because I was jealous that a successful tech CEO had chosen her instead of me. She declared that I spent my entire pathetic life staring at spreadsheets because no man would ever want me, and this was my sick way of getting attention. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match her hysterics. I simply looked at her glittering wrist. I told the crowd exactly how much that bracelet cost and provided the exact date the funds were wired from Julian's corporate account to the jeweler. Jada instinctively grabbed her wrist, taking a sudden step back as the undeniable truth hit the audience. Julian desperately tried to regain control of the narrative. He stepped in front of Jada, sweating profusely through his custom suit. He puffed out his chest and attempted to drown me in convoluted tech jargon. He loudly announced to the agitated investors that the bankruptcy filing was merely a strategic agile pivot. He claimed he was restructuring corporate debt to facilitate a Series B bridge financing round. He threw out phrases like algorithmic scaling user acquisition burn rates and temporary pre-revenue restructuring, hoping the wealthy doctors and lawyers in the crowd would be too intimidated by Silicon Valley terminology to question him. I dismantled him with surgical precision. I spoke clearly, projecting my voice so every single person on my lawn could hear the financial autopsy. I told Julian there was no agile pivot. I stated that his company had exactly 0 active engineers on payroll and 0 proprietary patents filed. I broke down his burn rate, explaining that 100% of his outgoing capital over the last 8 months had gone toward exotic car leases, 5-star European vacations, and luxury retail purchases. I turned to the furious crowd and informed them that Julian was not raising capital for software infrastructure. He was soliciting donations under the guise of a charity gala to replace the seed money he had already embezzled before his initial investors filed for a federal audit. The fallout was immediate and absolute. The atmosphere shifted from a high society fundraiser to an angry mob. A prominent real estate developer who had already written a check for $50,000 reached over the table and snatched it back from Brenda's hands. Voices overlapped in outrage. People were demanding explanations, threatening to call the fraud division of the district attorney's office, and loudly warning their peers to freeze any transfers they had authorized. The carefully curated illusion of the Wilson family's untouchable prestige shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of my parents' eyes. Brenda was hyperventilating, frantically trying to grab the arms of her departing sorority sisters, begging them to stay and listen to reason. Julian was backed against his useless marketing banner. His face pale as he realized his white-collar crime had just been exposed to a demographic of highly educated, extremely well-connected professionals who did not take kindly to being scammed. As the party completely collapsed into chaos, I felt a heavy, violent grip close around my upper arm. Calvin spun me around. His face was inches from mine, completely contorted with a rage so deep it made his entire body tremble. The polished, benevolent patriarch was gone. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. His grip tightened his fingers, bruising my skin through the fabric of my blazer. He pulled me into the shadows near the edge of the pavilion, away from the screaming investors. "You think you are smart?" Calvin, hissed his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the noise of the ruined gala. You think you can humiliate me in front of my own community and just walk away? You think you hold all the cards because you own this dirt? I stared back at him, refusing to show a single ounce of fear. I told him he was out of money and out of options. I reminded him that the sheriff would be back in exactly 4 days to physically remove him and his fraudulent son-in-law from my property. Calvin let out a dark, breathless laugh. He leaned in closer, his eyes burning with a desperate, malicious triumph. I just listed the family heirlooms and your grandmother's entire vintage art collection for auction, he whispered, delivering the words like a physical blow. The auction house advanced the funds this morning. We will have enough liquid cash to fight your eviction in civil court for years. My blood ran completely cold. The ambient noise of the collapsing party faded into a distant ringing in my ears. He had touched the one thing, the only thing I still held sacred. My grandmother's art. The only pure legacy left in this corrupted family. Calvin smiled, watching the horror finally register on my face. He released my arm and told me the game was just getting started. I did not give my father the satisfaction of seeing me break. I pulled my arm from his grasp, the silk of my blazer smoothing out as I took a deliberate, measured step back from the shadows of the pavilion tent. The chaos of the ruined gala was deafening behind me. I could hear Dr. Vance's colleagues shouting demands at Julian, the shrill panic in Brenda's voice as she tried to placate furious investors, and the sound of a carefully curated social empire collapsing in real time. But it all faded into white noise. The moment Calvin mentioned my grandmother's art, the final fraying emotional tether that still connected me to my parents completely severed. I turned on my heel and walked straight to my car, leaving my father standing alone in the wreckage of his own making. I dialed Terrence the second my engine roared to life. I did not bother explaining the disaster of the charity event. I went straight to the financial threat. I told him Calvin was liquidating the family heirlooms and the vintage art collection to fund a protracted legal war against my eviction. Terrence swore sharply under his breath. As a corporate litigator who navigated Atlanta's high society disputes, he knew exactly what collection I was talking about. It was not just decorative estate dressing purchased by interior designers. It was a museum-grade portfolio. Terrence explained the immediate legal danger. Since Apex Holdings owned the physical estate, the structure and the grounds belonged to me. However, Calvin was exploiting a massive legal gray area by claiming the art collection was his personal movable property rather than a fixture of the house. Because the collection was originally acquired before my father's financial ruin, he was attempting to leverage it for a massive, unregulated cash advance. Terrence warned me that if Calvin signed an irrevocable transfer of title with an auction house, the gallery would take legal custody of the physical assets. They could pack the paintings into climate-controlled transport trucks and lock them in a private vault before the courts even opened on Monday morning, making it nearly impossible to retrieve them without years of grueling, expensive federal litigation. I spent the entirety of Sunday locked in my home office, my monitors glowing with complex routing data. Calvin had bragged about receiving an advance, meaning a preliminary wire transfer had already hit a holding account. I deployed my forensic tracking software, searching for large incoming institutional transfers flagged under Calvin's remaining active credit lines. By Sunday night, I found the origin point. It was a boutique ultra-exclusive fine art brokerage in the heart of Buckhead, known for handling discreet, highly expedited liquidations for desperate millionaires who needed cash before their bankruptcies went public. I picked Terrence up in my car before the sun had fully risen on Monday morning. We drove down Peachtree Road in a tense, heavy silence. I gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, the weight of what Calvin was attempting pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. That art collection was never just canvas and oil to me. It was my grandmother. She was a woman who understood true intrinsic value in a world obsessed with cheap aesthetics. When Calvin and Brenda looked at me growing up, they only saw a stubborn, unglamorous bookkeeper who refused to play their high society games. They poured all their affection and resources into molding Jada into the perfect, vapid socialite. But my grandmother saw my mind. She used to sit with me in the estate's sunroom, teaching me how to read financial markets, how to spot a terrible investment disguised as a golden opportunity, and most importantly, how to protect my independence. She had spent her life acquiring works by brilliant, underrepresented black artists, captivating pieces by Romare Bearden, Jacob Lawrence, and Alma Thomas, long before the mainstream luxury art world recognized their brilliance. She explicitly kept the collection housed in the main estate to anchor this family to its cultural roots, to ensure we never forgot the history and the struggle that afforded us our privilege. The fact that Calvin was literally trying to fence her legacy was a desecration I could not stomach. My father was willing to rip those masterpieces off the walls, selling off Black history to the highest bidder, just to fund a fraudulent legal defense for a white con artist who had spent the last 8 months scamming their entire community. Terrence broke the silence as we navigated the morning traffic. He reviewed the injunction paperwork he had drafted overnight, confirming that we had the legal authority to halt the consignment if we could intercept the final signatures. He told me we had to stop the pen from hitting the paper. If the final transfer document was executed, the gallery director would release the remainder of the auction advance directly into Julian's hollow corporate account, and the art would be legally gone. We arrived at the Buckhead Gallery just before 9 o'clock. The building was a fortress of polished concrete and frosted glass, intentionally designed to look intimidating to the average pedestrian, while offering absolute privacy to its elite clientele. I did not wait for the valet. I parked my car directly in the loading zone, killed the engine, and stepped out onto the pristine pavement. I pushed through the heavy custom glass doors, the sharp chill of the gallery's climate control hitting my face. The expansive showroom was dead silent, the walls lined with expensive modern installations that felt entirely soulless. I ignored the sharply dressed receptionist, sitting near the entrance, striding purposefully past the velvet ropes with Terrence a half step behind me. The click of my heels echoed sharply against the polished floors as I moved toward the private soundproof alcove at the back of the building. Through the clear glass partition of the executive suite, I saw them. The gallery director, a slick, impeccably groomed man with a measuring gaze, sat behind a massive minimalist marble desk. Sitting directly across from him were Calvin and Julian. My father looked exhausted but triumphant, while Julian wore the smug, arrogant smirk of a man who believed he had just outsmarted the system one more time. Between them rested a thick stack of final consignment releases. I did not knock. I placed my hand on the chrome handle, shoved the heavy glass door open, and walked directly into the room, just as the gallery director handed Calvin a silver pen. "Put the pen down, Calvin," I said. My voice did not echo in the soundproof executive suite, but it carried the weight of an absolute command. The gallery director physically jolted his hand, pulling back from the marble desk, as if the silver pen had suddenly caught fire. He looked from me to Terrence, whose imposing frame and tailored charcoal suit immediately registered as high-priced legal muscle. The director was a man who facilitated quiet, desperate transactions for a living. He recognized the arrival of a massive liability when it walked through his door. Julian, however, possessed the boundless, unearned confidence of a mediocre man who had never faced a real consequence. He did not look startled. He actually let out a short, condescending laugh. He buttoned the center button of his designer jacket, a jacket paid for with embezzled investor funds, and turned to face me with a sickeningly sweet smile. "Zuri, I really admire your dedication to this little tantrum," Julian said, shaking his head as if dealing with a petulant toddler. He looked at the gallery director, offering a conspiratorial man-to-man roll of the eyes. "I apologize for the interruption, Richard. This is my sister-in-law. She has a bit of a flair for the dramatic. We are dealing with a minor internal family dispute over a residential lease." Julian turned his attention back to me, stepping slightly in front of Calvin. He crossed his arms and adopted the tone of a patient professor explaining a simple concept to a slow student. He told me that my little eviction stunt at the guest house was cute, but it showed a fundamental lack of understanding of basic property law. He smirked, his pale blue eyes gleaming with arrogant triumph. "Personal property is not real estate, Zuri," Julian stated, enunciating every syllable. You might own the physical dirt the estate sits on thanks to whatever predatory loophole you used against Calvin, but you do not own the movable assets inside the main house. Calvin is the patriarch. He owns the art. He has the absolute right to consign his own property to fund my legal defense against your fraudulent eviction. You have absolutely no power in this room. You are a glorified bookkeeper. Run along back to your spreadsheets and let the adults finish their business. I let his words hang in the sterile, climate-controlled air of the gallery. I did not yell. I did not react to his blatant disrespect. I shifted my gaze away from Julian, entirely treating him like the irrelevant background noise he truly was, and looked directly at my father. Calvin was sweating. Beads of moisture gathered along his hairline despite the chilled air of the room. He refused to meet my eyes, staring instead at the thick stack of consignment papers resting on the marble desk. "Are you really going to do this?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet. "You are going to rip your own mother's legacy off the walls to bail out a fraud." My father's head snapped up. The shame in his eyes instantly transmuted into a toxic defensive rage. He slammed his fist down on the armrest of his leather chair. "How dare you speak to me that way?" Calvin spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and desperate justification. "I am the head of this family. I make the decisions that secure our future. Julian is building an empire. He is building generational wealth that will elevate the Wilson name to heights you cannot even comprehend. He just needs temporary liquidity to restructure his corporate debt and bridge his next funding round. He is building the family's future Zuri. You are just trying to destroy it." Calvin stood up, pointing an accusing finger at me. He claimed I was bitter. He told the gallery director that I had always been jealous of Jada's happiness, that I resented Julian's brilliant tech mind because I was trapped in a mundane accounting job. He rationalized his horrific betrayal with astonishing ease. He loudly declared that the art collection was just gathering dust in the sunroom, serving absolutely no purpose. He claimed his mother, a woman who had meticulously curated those pieces to preserve Black history, would have gladly sold every canvas to support her grandson-in-law's brilliant entrepreneurial vision. "You are a destructive, miserable woman," Calvin snarled, his chest heaving. "Julian is the best thing to ever happen to this family. I will not let your petty single-woman bitterness ruin your sister's life. Richard, give me the pen. We are finishing this transaction right now." The gallery director looked at Terrence, clearly terrified of being caught in the crossfire of a massive legal liability. Terrence did not say a word. He simply offered a cold, predatory smile that made the director take a very deliberate step away from the desk. I stepped forward. I invaded Julian's personal space, forcing him to take a clumsy step backward. I looked down at the consignment papers. Calvin had already initialed the first 2 pages. He was seconds away from signing over a multi-million-dollar museum-grade collection for a fraction of its worth, all to fund Julian's fabricated tech empire. I reached out and placed my hand flat over the signature line of the consignment contract. "Your fundamental problem, Julian," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the silent room, "is that you consistently mistake my silence for ignorance. You assume because I am a Black woman, I must be the help. You assume Calvin has the power because he is a man. You are about to learn a very painful lesson regarding assumptions." I extended my free hand toward Terrence. Without a word, my lead corporate litigator unclasped his leather briefcase. He extracted a single thick manila folder and placed it firmly in my palm. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I slid a yellowed, heavily notarized document out of the folder and dropped it directly onto the gallery director's marble desk, completely covering Calvin's consignment papers. The document bore the unmistakable raised seal of the Fulton County Probate Court. That is the legally binding, incontestable last will and testament of my grandmother, Evelyn Wilson. I stated the absolute certainty of my words, pinning Calvin to his chair. "A document that was executed and sealed 10 years before you bankrupted this family, Calvin. Look at page 4, section 2. The gallery director, unable to help himself, leaned forward and adjusted his glasses. Calvin's face drained of all color. "My grandmother knew exactly what kind of man you were." I continued, ensuring every syllable struck like a hammer. "She knew you would eventually bleed this family dry to finance your own ego. She never left that art collection to you. It was placed into a blind trust. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the heavy cardstock. A trust that explicitly named me as the sole executor and absolute legal owner of every single canvas the second I turned 25. I turned my head slowly, locking eyes with Julian. His arrogant smirk had completely vanished, replaced by a hollow, sickening realization. Personal property is indeed separate from real estate, Julian, I said, offering him a razor-thin smile. But you cannot fence property that belongs to me. This consignment is entirely fraudulent. If you or this gallery attempt to move a single frame from my estate, I will have you both indicted for grand larceny before lunchtime. Richard, the impeccably groomed gallery director, stared at the raised seal of the Fulton County Probate Court as if it were highly radioactive. The lucrative high-stakes art world operated strictly on ironclad discretion and unblemished provenance. The mere whisper of grand larceny was enough to permanently destroy a brokerage's reputation. Richard did not ask Calvin for an explanation. He did not attempt to negotiate or mediate the dispute. He pushed his ergonomic chair back with such violent force that the wheels shrieked against the polished concrete floor. He threw his hands into the air, physically distancing himself from the marble desk and the tainted consignment papers resting upon it. He addressed Calvin with a voice shaking with absolute panic and fury. He declared the consignment instantly void. He stated that his accounting department would be reversing the preliminary cash advance wire within the hour, and he demanded that both Calvin and Julian vacate his establishment immediately before he contacted his own corporate legal counsel. He made it abundantly clear that his gallery would have absolutely no part in fencing stolen property for a bankrupt patriarch. Calvin looked like a man who had just been shoved out of a soaring airplane without a parachute. His broad chest deflated, and the arrogant patriarchal posturing evaporated into sheer, unadulterated terror. He reached a trembling hand toward the consignment papers, perhaps hoping to snatch them back and destroy the evidence, but Terrence was faster. My lead corporate litigator casually placed his heavy hand over the stack, smoothly sliding the documents into his leather briefcase to preserve them as hard evidence of the attempted fraud. The heavy glass door to the executive suite suddenly swung open, shattering the tense silence of the room. Brenda stumbled into the alcove. She had clearly been pacing the main gallery showroom, eagerly waiting for the massive payout to secure her comfortable lifestyle, and had watched the entire catastrophic confrontation unfold through the clear glass partition. The pristine country club matriarch facade she had maintained for 3 decades, completely shattered. She took one look at Calvin's ashen face, saw Terrence securing the legal documents, and her knees simply gave out. Brenda collapsed onto the expensive modern rug right in the center of the room. She grabbed the hem of my silk blazer, her manicured nails digging frantically into the fabric. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect expensive makeup. She did not apologize for attempting to steal from me. She did not apologize for the years of systemic emotional abuse, or for supporting the fraudulent lease lawsuit that was meant to leave me homeless. Instead, she begged me not to ruin Jada. She wept openly, crying that Julian going to a federal prison would destroy her daughter's carefully curated social standing. She sobbed that a public scandal of this magnitude would ruin the Wilson name in Atlanta forever, ensuring they would be exiled from their elite circles. She pleaded with me to drop the issue, to just let them have the vintage art collection, claiming that I did not even care about high society and did not truly need the money. She rationalized their criminal behavior by insisting that Julian was just going through a rough patch and needed my grandmother's legacy to fix his mistakes. I looked down at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I firmly pulled my jacket from her desperate grip and took a step back. I looked at Brenda and told her she was currently kneeling on a gallery floor, begging me to let her steal the only pure, untainted thing left in our entire family just to protect a verified scam artist. I reminded her of Evelyn Wilson. I told my mother that my grandmother was the only person in that sprawling, toxic estate who had ever looked at me and seen a valuable daughter rather than a profound disappointment. My grandmother had spent decades meticulously building that specific collection to preserve our cultural heritage and anchor our family to reality. Now Brenda and Calvin were perfectly willing to rip our history off the walls and fence it to the highest bidder, just to keep Jada in designer shoes and Julian out of handcuffs. I stepped around Brenda and faced Calvin and Julian directly. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping all emotion from my delivery to ensure the absolute severity of my words penetrated their panic. I issued my ultimatum. I told them they had exactly until 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon to completely drop the fraudulent lease lawsuit they had filed against me. I demanded they pack their belongings and vacate both the guest house and the main estate without causing a single cent of damage. I made it unequivocally clear that if I saw a single moving box, a single luxury car, or a single family member left on my property, by the time the sun set on Friday, I would personally walk into the district attorney's office. I promised them I would hand over the forged consignment papers, Julian's heavily audited bank records, and the undeniable proof of their coordinated attempt to fence $3 million of stolen art. I told them they would all be facing felony grand larceny and conspiracy charges, and I would personally ensure the prosecution sought maximum prison sentences for every single one of them. Calvin squeezed his eyes shut, physically, bracing himself against the edge of the marble desk as the reality of his total inescapable ruin finally set in. He knew I had him dead to rights. But Julian simply could not accept defeat. His massive, fragile ego could not process being cornered and bested by a black woman he deemed vastly inferior. He straightened his designer tie aggressively, stepping over his weeping mother-in-law on the floor, and sneered at me. He looked me up and down with utter venomous contempt. He told me I was completely out of my depth. He bragged that he had an entire team of ruthless corporate lawyers on retainer who would tie me up in endless litigation for the next decade. He leaned in close, his face flushed with unearned arrogance, and told me I was just a glorified bookkeeper playing out of my league. He promised me he would never surrender the estate, and he practically spat the words, declaring that we would see each other in court. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice or attempt to match his hostility. I simply smiled. Julian had just made the fatal, irrevocable mistake of choosing to go under oath. Julian's arrogance at the gallery was not merely a bluff. It was a profound, catastrophic miscalculation. He actually believed his own fabricated hype. He truly thought that because he had successfully conned his way through Silicon Valley networking events and local country club dinners, he could con a judge in a court of law. He chose to ignore my Friday deadline. He chose not to vacate the estate. Instead, he forced the eviction into a formal hearing, confident that his high-priced legal team would easily crush a solitary accountant. The heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Courthouse closed behind us on Monday morning, sealing us inside the sterile, wood-paneled arena of Division 4. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady drone, masking the tension radiating from the plaintiff's table. Calvin and Brenda sat beside Julian's lead attorney. They looked a full decade older than they had just days prior on my limestone patio. The sheer exhaustion of maintaining their crumbling social facade was etched deep into my mother's face. Her posture was slumped, her designer clothing hanging slightly loose on her frame. Calvin stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, refusing to glance in my direction. They looked terrified, but they were clinging desperately to the manufactured confidence radiating from the man walking up to the witness box. Julian took the stand wearing a bespoke charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than a standard compact car. He adjusted his silk tie and settled into the chair, practically oozing a slick, unearned arrogance. He looked completely at ease. He treated the witness stand like a fireside chat at a tech symposium rather than a legal proceeding under the strict penalty of perjury. He offered a warm, charismatic smile to Judge Caldwell, a seasoned, no-nonsense magistrate, who peered down at him over the rim of her reading glasses. Julian's attorney, a man whose tailored presence screamed astronomical hourly billing rates, guided him smoothly through the direct examination. Julian placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the whole truth, and immediately began to lie with breathtaking fluency. He testified under oath that the $50,000 commercial lease for my guest house was an absolute legally binding reality. He spoke with the rhythmic, persuasive cadence of a master salesman. He claimed he had transferred those funds in good faith, utilizing his corporate accounts to secure a stable, comfortable home for his beloved in-laws while he dedicated his time to building his generational tech empire. He looked the judge dead in the eye and swore the transaction was entirely above board. Then Julian shifted his focus to character assassination. He sighed heavily, performing a masterclass in feigned reluctant sympathy. He painted a vivid, entirely fabricated picture for the court. He described me as a rogue, unhinged daughter, deeply resentful of my younger sister's glamorous success and my parents' enduring happiness. He testified that my attempt to evict Calvin and Brenda was a vindictive, illegal stunt driven by pure, unchecked jealousy. He leaned forward, lowering his voice to sound appropriately sorrowful. He claimed I was experiencing a severe mental health crisis, lashing out aggressively because I was a lonely, bitter bookkeeper who could not stand to see her family thriving. He swore that the bankruptcy filings I had shown Dr. Vance were crude forgeries fabricated by a desperate woman trying to cause emotional distress and derail a multi-million-dollar software launch. Brenda dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the heartbroken, victimized mother to absolute perfection. Jada sat in the gallery row directly behind them, glaring daggers at the back of my head, nodding emphatically along with every single lie her husband spun. They really thought they were winning. They believed that because Julian sounded expensive and used the right corporate buzzwords, the justice system would simply bend to his reality. They thought a bespoke suit and a confident tone were enough to override cold, hard documentation. The plaintiff's attorney concluded his direct examination and returned to his seat looking immensely satisfied with the narrative they had constructed. Judge Caldwell made a note in her ledger, then turned her attention to our side of the aisle. She looked at Terrence and asked if the defense wished to cross-examine the witness. Terrence stood up slowly. The shift in the room's energy was immediate and palpable. He buttoned his jacket, his movements deliberate, methodical, and entirely unhurried. He did not carry a single piece of paper regarding property law. He did not bring up the residential eviction statutes. He walked toward the podium, the sudden silence in the courtroom amplifying the sharp, authoritative click of his leather shoes against the floor. Julian offered Terrence a patronizing, relaxed smile. He shifted his weight in the witness chair, clearly expecting to bat away tedious questions about lease dates, property lines, and family grievances. He was prepared to double down on the narrative of the jealous, unhinged sister-in-law. Terrence did not ask a single question about the guest house. He did not mention the eviction notice or my parents' living arrangements. He completely ignored the emotional family drama Julian had just spent 20 minutes carefully constructing. Terrence planted his hands firmly on the edges of the wooden podium. He looked directly into Julian's arrogant eyes, letting a heavy, suffocating beat of silence pass between them. Then, with the clinical precision of a predator, springing a meticulously laid trap, Terrence pivoted the entire trajectory of the hearing. He asked Julian to confirm under penalty of perjury his exact corporate routing numbers. Terrence then asked Julian to verify the specific dates of 3 separate offshore wire transfers. He rattled off the exact amounts of seed capital moved from a domestic business account into an unregulated shell company in the Cayman Islands. The smirk vanished from Julian's face instantly. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a ghost in a very expensive suit. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Julian realized in a fraction of a second that Terrence was not defending a simple eviction. Terrence was establishing an ironclad sworn timeline for federal wire fraud. Terrence did not allow the silence to stretch long enough for Julian's highly paid attorney to formulate an objection. He smoothly pivoted to face Judge Caldwell, requesting immediate permission to enter Defense Exhibit F into the official court record. The bailiff stepped forward, taking a thick, securely bound stack of documents from Terrence and distributing copies to the judge, the plaintiff's counsel, and finally to Julian sitting in the witness box. I sat perfectly still at the defense table, watching the trap I had meticulously built over the past 3 weeks finally snap shut. These were not standard bank statements. They were the results of the forensic accounting algorithms I had run on Julian's shell companies. Terrence instructed the courtroom clerk to project the first page of the exhibit onto the large digital monitors mounted on the walls. The screen illuminated with a highly detailed financial flowchart. Terrence walked back to the podium, resting his hands on the edges of the wood. He asked Julian to direct his attention to the highlighted transfer on page 3. Terrence read the numbers aloud, his voice carrying the steady, resonant authority of a seasoned prosecutor. He noted a withdrawal of exactly $50,000 made on October 12th from a primary retirement account belonging to Calvin Wilson. Terrence then pointed to the corresponding deposit made just 6 hours later. The exact same sum of $50,000 landed in the primary operating account of Apex Solutions, a corporate entity solely owned by Julian. Julian swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed against his tailored collar. He attempted to lean back in his chair to project an air of unbothered confidence, but his posture was rigid. He opened his mouth to deploy more Silicon Valley buzzwords, but Terrence cut him off with a surgical strike. Terrence asked Julian to confirm if Apex Solutions was a registered property management firm. Julian stammered, stating it was a diversified holding company. Terrence pressed harder, asking why a diversified holding company was collecting residential lease payments for a guest house it did not own, operate, or maintain. Julian's eyes darted toward his attorney, a silent plea for an objection, but his counsel was furiously flipping through the forensic packet, his face draining of color as he realized his own client had lied to him. Without waiting for Julian to formulate a lie, Terrence moved to the next slide. He mapped the exact trajectory of Calvin's $50,000. He showed the court that the money never sat in an escrow account. It never went toward property taxes, maintenance, or estate management. Within 24 hours of Calvin making the transfer, the funds were splintered. Terrence documented $20,000 wired directly to a luxury car dealership in Buckhead. He traced another $15,000 to a high-end jeweler in Milan. The remaining $15,000 was funneled into an offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands. Julian's carefully constructed facade completely fractured. The arrogant smirk melted into an expression of sheer panic. He began to sweat visibly, moisture beading on his forehead under the harsh fluorescent courtroom lights. He grabbed his glass of water with a trembling hand, splashing a few drops onto the wooden ledge of the witness stand. He stammered into the microphone, his voice an octave higher than it had been during his direct examination. He babbled about rapid capital deployment, decentralized asset management, and the necessity of liquid overhead in the tech sector. None of it made sense. None of it applied to a residential eviction hearing. I shifted my gaze from the crumbling witness to the plaintiff's table. Calvin was staring at the digital monitors. He looked like a man who had just been in a devastating car crash. His mouth hung slightly open, his eyes tracking the red arrows that mapped his depleted retirement savings directly into Julian's pockets. The realization hit Calvin in real time. The brilliant, lucrative investment returns Julian had been promising him for the last year were entirely fictional. The modest dividend checks Calvin had received were not profits from a booming tech startup. Julian was simply feeding Calvin small fractions of his own stolen money to keep him compliant, a classic textbook Ponzi scheme executed against his own father-in-law. Calvin slowly turned his head to look at Julian. The absolute adoration and blind faith he had harbored for his golden son-in-law vanished, replaced by a hollow, sickening horror. Brenda sat frozen next to him, her hand covering her mouth, as she watched her daughter's luxurious lifestyle being exposed as a criminal enterprise on public record. Terrence did not give them a moment to breathe. He stepped away from the podium and walked directly toward the witness stand. He reminded Julian that less than 20 minutes ago he had sworn under oath that the $50,000 transfer was a legitimate, verifiable residential lease payment intended to secure housing for his in-laws. Terrence raised his voice, the sound echoing off the wood-paneled walls. He asked Julian if he understood the federal penalties for committing perjury in a court of law. He asked if laundering a stolen retirement fund through a corporate shell company to buy a sports car constituted a standard lease agreement in the state of Georgia. Judge Caldwell leaned forward over her bench. She lowered her reading glasses, her eyes narrowing into a lethal glare directed entirely at Julian. She did not strike Terrence's aggressive questioning from the record. She instructed the witness to answer the question. Julian was hyperventilating now. He tugged violently at his bespoke silk tie, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked frantically at his lawyer, who was staring down at his legal pad, actively calculating his own liability for presenting a perjured witness. Julian gripped the edges of the witness box, his knuckles white, completely unable to form a coherent sentence. Terrence let Julian suffer under the heavy, suffocating silence of the courtroom for 10 agonizing seconds. Then he turned his back on the witness stand and walked calmly to our defense table. Terrence looked at the judge and announced that the defense had one final exhibit to enter into the record. He reached into his briefcase. He did not pull out another bank statement. He pulled out a single neatly printed document. Terrence stated it was a subpoenaed email retrieved directly from Julian's encrypted private server. Terrence held the single sheet of paper aloft, the stark white contrast of the document drawing every eye in the silent courtroom. He did not rush. He allowed the sheer gravity of the moment to settle over the room, letting Julian marinate in the absolute certainty of his impending destruction. Julian's highly paid attorney finally jolted into action, practically leaping out of his leather chair to shout a frantic objection, claiming the document lacked foundation and was entirely irrelevant to a residential eviction hearing. Judge Caldwell did not even look at the defense attorney. She kept her steely gaze locked entirely on the sweating, hyperventilating man in the witness box. She flatly overruled the objection, citing that the plaintiff had willfully opened the door to financial scrutiny the second he swore under oath that the contested $50,000 was a legitimate lease payment. She ordered Terrence to proceed. Terrence adjusted his suit jacket and turned to face the digital monitors mounted on the courtroom walls. He instructed the clerk to display Defense Exhibit G. The screen flickered, projecting a crystal-clear image of an email thread retrieved directly from Julian's encrypted private server. Terrence approached the podium and began to read the metadata aloud for the court record. He noted the date a mere 3 days after Calvin had wired the funds. He noted the sender, Julian. He then noted the recipient, an email address belonging to a woman named Chloe, who was most certainly not Julian's wife. Julian's face drained of the last remaining drop of color. He gripped the wooden ledge of the witness box so tightly his knuckles turned a translucent white. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of the gallows, listening to the lever being pulled. Terrence cleared his throat, his deep voice carrying flawlessly across the hushed gallery. He began reading Julian's own words verbatim. Terrence read how Julian boasted about his weekend in Las Vegas. He read the exact sentence where Julian complained about a massive string of bad luck at the baccarat tables and the resulting aggressive calls from his bookies. Terrence did not pause for dramatic effect. The raw text was devastating enough on its own. He read the paragraph where Julian assured Chloe that his massive gambling debts were no longer a problem. Terrence read the exact unforgivable phrase where Julian bragged about fleecing his wife's gullible parents to cover his losses. Terrence read the final lines of the email with surgical precision. Julian had typed out in black and white that Calvin and Brenda were the easiest marks he had ever met in his life. He bragged that they actually bought his entire visionary tech genius routine without asking for a single audited financial statement. He promised Chloe that the $50,000 covered the Vegas marker, and he planned to squeeze the old man for another $100,000 by Christmas to fund their upcoming trip to the Maldives. The silence that followed the reading of the email was absolute ringing in my ears with the deafening weight of total vindication. Terrence slowly lowered the document, resting it on the podium. He did not ask Julian to verify the email. He did not need to. The digital projection hovering over the courtroom spoke for itself. A sudden piercing shriek shattered the quiet of the courtroom. Jada shot up from her seat in the front row of the gallery. The pristine, untouchable golden child facade she had maintained for her entire life completely dissolved into pure primal rage. She ignored the bailiff stepping forward. She ignored the sanctity of the legal proceedings. She lunged against the low wooden partition, separating the gallery from the court floor, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at her husband. Jada screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with the agonizing realization of her total betrayal. She demanded to know who Chloe was. She shrieked that she had spent the last 2 years defending him, lying for him, and demanding her parents empty their accounts to support his brilliant vision. She screamed that he had used her family as a personal ATM to fund a mistress and a crippling gambling addiction. Her perfect blowout was a mess. Her designer dress wrinkled as she thrashed against the partition, sobbing and hurling obscenities at the man in the witness box. Calvin did not move to comfort his favorite daughter. The formidable patriarch of the Wilson family seemed to shrink rapidly within his tailored suit. He slumped heavily against the plaintiff's table, his hand flying up to clutch his chest. His breathing became ragged and shallow. He stared blindly at the floor, the horrifying reality crashing down upon him. He had chosen this fraud over his own flesh and blood. He had actively plotted to leave me homeless and ruin my life, all to protect a con artist who was secretly laughing at his stupidity. The generational empire he had obsessed over, the elite social standing he had sacrificed my childhood to maintain, had all been liquidated to pay off illegal casino markers. Calvin looked completely broken, his towering ego shattered beyond any hope of repair. Beside him, Brenda began to sob uncontrollably. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with the force of her panic. She was not crying for Jada's broken marriage. She was crying because she knew exactly what this meant. The email was public record. The fraud was exposed in open court. By dinner time, the entire Atlanta high society circuit would know that Calvin and Brenda Wilson had been spectacularly conned. Their social, financial, and familial standing had simply evaporated under the fluorescent lights of Division 4. They were ruined. I sat perfectly still at the defense table, watching the chaotic, poetic justice unfold. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I simply watched the inevitable consequences of their own toxic choices consume them. Judge Caldwell had seen enough. She brought her wooden gavel down against the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack that cut instantly through Jada's screaming and Brenda's sobbing. She demanded absolute order in her courtroom, her voice booming with unchecked judicial fury. 2 armed bailiffs immediately moved in, physically restraining Jada and forcing her back into her seat, while the defense attorney desperately tried to quiet his clients. Judge Caldwell glared down at Julian, her expression radiating absolute disgust. She stated for the official record that the $50,000 lease agreement was a verified malicious fraud. She struck the plaintiff's lawsuit from the docket with extreme prejudice, declaring the entire filing a frivolous mockery of the justice system. Without a second of hesitation, she turned her attention to my side of the room and granted me immediate, uncontested eviction rights, ordering Calvin, Brenda, and Julian to vacate my property within 24 hours or face forceful removal by the sheriff's department. Julian finally found his voice, sputtering a weak, pathetic attempt at an apology, but Judge Caldwell instantly silenced him. She pointed her gavel directly at his face. She informed Julian that he was not leaving her courtroom. She ordered the bailiffs to detain him immediately for blatant contempt of court and aggravated perjury. As the heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly around Julian's wrists, Judge Caldwell looked down at the ruined, weeping remnants of my family. She coldly noted for the record that she was forwarding the entire unredacted evidence packet, including the forensic accounting and the subpoenaed emails, directly to the district attorney's office with a formal recommendation to pursue maximum charges for wire fraud and criminal conspiracy. The Friday morning air possessed a sharp, biting chill that felt entirely appropriate for the atmosphere settling over Kensington Avenue. I parked my car directly across the street from the main iron gates of the estate, leaving the engine running. The low, steady hum of the motor served as a quiet soundtrack to the absolute destruction of the Wilson family facade. I leaned back against the leather seat, resting my hands on the steering wheel. I felt no triumph. I felt no lingering anger. I only experienced a profound clinical detachment as I watched the inevitable consequences of their monumental arrogance unfold in real time. In the dead center of the sprawling circular driveway sat a battered, rust-streaked commercial moving truck. Its faded yellow siding and dented bumper stood out as a grotesque, glaring blemish against the pristine limestone pillars of the property. For 3 decades, that driveway had exclusively hosted imported luxury sedans and sleek European sports cars. Now it hosted the undeniable heavy machinery of the working class. It was the physical manifestation of their total financial ruin. Calvin emerged from the heavy mahogany front doors, and the sight was almost jarring. The great patriarch of the Wilson family was carrying a heavily taped cardboard box marked with a black marker. The broad, imposing shoulders that used to aggressively command boardrooms and silence dinner tables were completely stooped. The bespoke tailored suits were gone, replaced by a pair of wrinkled khakis and a sweat-stained polo shirt. He looked incredibly frail gray and fundamentally broken. A man who had previously refused to carry his own golf clubs was now reduced to performing unpaid manual labor because his accounts were frozen, his credit lines were dead, and he could no longer afford to hire a moving crew. Calvin dragged his feet across the concrete, aggressively avoiding eye contact with the street. He was thoroughly crushed by the weight of his own staggering hubris. Julian had not merely stolen his massive retirement funds. Julian had stolen his absolute authority, stripping him of the one thing he valued above all else, his power. Jada followed closely behind him, and her reality was even more brutal. The untouchable golden child, the pristine princess of Atlanta. High society was currently dragging 2 heavy black trash bags down the grand marble steps. One of the bags caught sharply on a decorative iron railing. The thin plastic tore open instantly, spilling a vibrant cascade of expensive, useless designer silk dresses directly onto the dirty concrete. Jada did not bend down to salvage the clothing. She simply let go of the bags, covered her face with her hands, and began to weep hysterically. Her perfect, meticulously curated life had evaporated overnight. Her husband was sitting in a federal holding cell, actively being interrogated by the FBI, and his defense attorney had already signaled that Julian was perfectly willing to offer up his wife's family to secure a lighter sentence. All of Jada's joint accounts had been seized under federal wire fraud statutes. She had absolutely nothing left to her name, except the clothes she could cram into the back of a rented van. This spectacular downfall was not unfolding in a vacuum. Kensington Avenue was an elite gated neighborhood that thrived on immaculate appearances and quiet, ruthless gossip. The news of Julian's arrest, the fraudulent gallery consignment, and the humiliating courtroom implosion had swept through the local country club faster than a wildfire. The neighbors were out in full force, treating the eviction as a spectator sport. Mrs. Sterling stood boldly on her sweeping veranda next door wearing a silk morning robe. She was holding a porcelain coffee cup that she had not sipped from in 20 minutes, staring openly at the driveway with naked fascination. Across the street, Mr. Harrington had been pretending to prune the exact same section of his rosebush for over an hour, his eyes constantly darting toward the yellow moving truck. The pristine, untouchable image Calvin and Brenda had sacrificed my entire childhood to build was gone forever. They were no longer the elite gatekeepers of their social circle. They were the neighborhood cautionary tale. They were a spectacular, humiliating disgrace being broadcast in broad daylight, and they knew every single person on the block was watching them fall. Finally, Brenda walked out of the house. She was utterly unrecognizable. The flawless professional blowouts, the tailored couture dresses, and the heavy diamond jewelry were entirely stripped away. She wore a pair of faded sweatpants and an oversized, shapeless sweater. Her face was completely bare, devoid of the expensive makeup she used as armor, revealing every deep line of stress, exhaustion, and panic. She was carrying a heavy plastic storage bin, visibly struggling under the weight of it, her shoulders shaking with every step. Brenda paused at the bottom of the marble steps to catch her breath. She looked up, scanning the street, likely praying that the neighbors had gone back inside. Her eyes swept past the Sterling property, moved past the Harrington driveway, and locked directly onto my car. We made eye contact through the windshield. I did not look away. I did not offer a sympathetic nod. I simply watched her. Desperation, raw and unfiltered, flooded Brenda's pale face. She did not call out for Calvin to help her. She did not look back at Jada crying on the steps. She simply let her hands open. The heavy plastic bin dropped directly onto the perfectly manicured lawn. The sharp, violent sound of breaking glass echoed across the quiet street as framed photos shattered inside the container, but Brenda did not even flinch. She stepped off the curb, leaving the shattered remnants of her personal history in the damp grass, and began walking directly across the asphalt toward my vehicle. She moved with a stiff, heavy determination, crossing the invisible boundary between her ruined life and my secured future. She reached my driver's side door and placed her trembling hands flat against the glass. I pressed the console button, allowing the tinted window to slide down with a quiet mechanical hum, letting the cold morning air fill the cabin. The crisp morning breeze carried the unmistakable scent of Brenda's expensive floral perfume, now soured by the stale sweat of manual labor and raw, unfiltered panic. She gripped the edge of my lowered window with both hands. Her knuckles were stark white, her manicured acrylic nails chipping against the hard glass. Up close, the devastation was even more pronounced. The heavy dark bags under her eyes and the violent trembling of her lower lip stripped away the last remaining shreds of the formidable, untouchable matriarch who had terrorized my childhood. "Zuri, please," Brenda gasped, her voice cracking as thick tears spilled over her lashes and tracked down her pale cheeks. "You have to listen to me. You have to understand what is happening to us." I kept both hands resting lightly on the leather steering wheel. I did not turn off the engine. The low, steady hum of the motor vibrated softly through the cabin, anchoring me to the present moment. I simply looked at her, waiting for the inevitable manipulation to begin. Brenda launched into a frantic, disjointed monologue. She attempted to rewrite the entire history of our family dynamic in the span of 60 seconds. She claimed she had been completely blinded by Calvin's domineering personality. She swore she had absolutely no idea Julian was a criminal, painting herself as a helpless, naive victim of two highly manipulative men. She wept openly, insisting that deep down she had always loved me. She claimed she had always been quietly proud of my fierce independence, but she simply did not know how to express it without angering her husband and disrupting the peace of the household. It was a spectacular, entirely pathetic performance. Then came the pivot. It was the same predictable pivot she had utilized her entire life when she needed something to maintain her pristine level of comfort. "We have absolutely nothing left, Zuri," Brenda sobbed, leaning closer to the window, her ragged breath fogging the pristine glass. "The federal agents froze every single one of Jada's accounts. Calvin's entire retirement fund is gone. The bank is officially foreclosing on their townhouse by the end of the month. We are currently trying to fit our entire lives into a rental van that smells like industrial bleach. We cannot live like this. Jada is completely falling apart out there. I am just asking for a small loan. Just enough cash to secure a decent, respectable apartment in a safe neighborhood until Calvin can figure out how to liquidate some minor assets. You have millions now. You own the entire estate. A few $1,000s means absolutely nothing to you, but it would save our lives right now." I let her words hang in the cold air. I listened to the distant, pathetic sound of Jada still weeping over her ruined designer clothes on the front lawn. I glanced across the street and watched Calvin standing completely frozen by the yellow rental van, too consumed by his own humiliation to come rescue his wife. I looked back at the woman who had birthed me, a woman currently begging for a financial handout from the daughter she had spent 3 decades systematically trying to destroy. "Do you remember the text message you sent me exactly 3 weeks ago?" I asked. My voice was dangerously calm, entirely devoid of the emotional volatility Brenda was desperately trying to provoke. Brenda blinked, her tears pausing for a fraction of a second in pure confusion. She shook her head, unable to recall her own casual cruelty. "I received it at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, right after I served the initial eviction notice to the guest house." I stated, enunciating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. "You typed it out yourself. You told me I was a miserable, toxic presence attempting to ruin my sister's flawless life. You said I was a bitter, jealous bookkeeper who would die completely alone because I lacked the basic human capacity for family loyalty. You explicitly stated that I was no longer a part of the Wilson family, and you demanded I drop the eviction case before you permanently destroyed my professional reputation in this city. Brenda's mouth opened and closed. A fresh wave of raw panic washed over her face as she realized I had kept the exact receipts of her abuse. She tried to stammer out a frantic defense, claiming she was just emotional and lashing out in fear, but I cut her off entirely. You did not send that text because you were blinded by Calvin. I continued, locking my gaze onto her terrified, bloodshot eyes. You sent it because you truly believed Julian was your golden ticket to endless, unearned wealth. Look at the trash bags on the lawn, Brenda. Look at your beloved Jada sobbing over ruined silk dresses. That is the reality you chose. When Julian stood in the gallery and mocked my career, when he laughed in my face and told me I was entirely beneath him, you did not say a single word in my defense. You stood there in absolute silence and waited for him to hand you a stolen check. Brenda let out a ragged, choking sob. She reached her hand through the open window, desperately trying to grab my arm, but I shifted back into the plush leather seat, ensuring she could not touch me. We are not family, Brenda, I said, delivering the final crushing blow with total clarity. We are simply two strangers who used to share an address. You placed all of your faith, all of your money, and all of your maternal loyalty into a con artist because he bought you expensive dinners and wore bespoke suits. You chose your golden child. Now you get to live the exact life he built for you. I did not wait for her to formulate another excuse. I did not offer her a single dime. I moved my finger to the door console and pulled the heavy switch. Brenda gasped quickly, snatching her hands back to avoid getting caught in the rising glass. The heavily tinted window glided upward with a smooth mechanical hum, instantly sealing the cabin and completely cutting off the sound of her frantic, pathetic apologies. The dark glass formed a permanent, impenetrable physical boundary between my secured future and her absolute ruin. I put the car in drive. I did not look in the rearview mirror as I pulled away from the curb. I steered my vehicle toward the grand wrought iron gates of the property, pressing the remote opener clipped to my visor. The massive metal gates swung open slowly, welcoming the rightful, undisputed owner of the estate. I drove straight through, leaving the wreckage of the Wilson family entirely in my past. The heavy wrought iron gates clicked shut behind my car, severing the final physical thread connecting me to the Wilson family. I put the vehicle in park near the grand entrance, cut the engine, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. For the first time in 30 years, the sprawling grounds were entirely silent. There were no contracted landscapers rushing to perfect the hedges before one of Brenda's lavish garden parties. There was no aggressive hum of Calvin's luxury sports cars idling in the driveway. The chaotic, suffocating energy that had defined my entire existence was simply gone. I pushed open the massive double doors and stepped into the grand foyer. The acoustics of the house had completely changed. My low heels clicked against the imported Italian marble, sending sharp, clear echoes bouncing off the high ceilings. The space felt enormous, hollowed out by the sudden, frantic departure of its former occupants. I walked slowly through the sweeping archways leading into the formal dining room. The heavy mahogany table where Calvin used to hold court and dictate the strict terms of our conditional love was absent. The walls previously adorned with ostentatious mirrors and gaudy sconces designed to project an image of untouchable wealth were now completely bare. Rectangular shadows stained the expensive wallpaper, marking the exact spots where Brenda's manufactured reality used to hang. I ran my hand along the cold plaster. Without their suffocating presence, the room was just an empty room. The oppressive atmosphere of unattainable expectations had been loaded into a cheap rental van and hauled away. I moved down the corridor and ascended the sweeping grand staircase. I turned toward the south wing, stepping into the massive master suite that had previously belonged to Jada and Julian. The plush custom carpets were deeply indented with the heavy footprints of the designer furniture they had frantically packed under the watchful eye of the county sheriff. This room had been the epicenter of Jada's unchecked entitlement. It was the space where she had hoarded luxury, throwing spectacular tantrums when her allowance was delayed by a single day entirely oblivious to the financial realities I managed to keep the estate afloat. Now it was just an empty box filled with stale air and the faint lingering scent of expensive hairspray. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows facing the sprawling backyard. I undid the heavy brass latches and pushed the glass panels wide open. The crisp, sharp autumn wind rushed into the room violently, flushing out the stagnant toxic air. I moved systematically through the second-floor opening every single window, throwing open the balcony doors, allowing the fresh breeze to sweep through the hollow corridors. I was physically purging the house of Calvin's overbearing ego, Brenda's calculated manipulations, and Julian's staggering criminal greed. Descending back to the main floor, I walked into the sprawling sunroom. This was the space where my grandmother Evelyn had originally housed her vintage art collection, the very collection Julian had so arrogantly attempted to fence. The walls here were different. They did not feel violated by the sudden emptiness. They felt protected. Evelyn had known exactly what kind of people her son and his family were. She had meticulously designed the blind trust to ensure that when the inevitable crash happened, the foundation of her legacy would survive. The art was currently secured in a climate-controlled vault in downtown Atlanta, entirely out of Julian's desperate reach. I stood in the center of the sunlit room, breathing in the cold air sweeping in from the gardens. For decades, this estate had operated as a fortress of conditional affection. It was a physical monument to a family that demanded absolute obedience and offered absolutely nothing in return. I had spent my entire life navigating its treacherous hallways, shrinking myself down to avoid Calvin's wrath, ignoring Brenda's passive-aggressive critiques, and silently subsidizing Jada's delusions. They had mistaken my quiet endurance for weakness. They had assumed my financial diligence was a sign of subservience. They never realized that every spreadsheet I managed, every legal document I filed, and every boundary I quietly established was part of a meticulously constructed safety net. The estate was no longer a symbol of my exclusion. It was the physical manifestation of my hard-won independence. It was mine free and clear, wiped clean of their fraudulent claims and emotional baggage. The raw bones of the mansion were structurally perfect, built on a solid foundation that had survived the catastrophic collapse of the Wilson social empire. I did not need to fill these rooms with expensive clutter to prove my worth. I did not need to host lavish parties to validate my existence. I reached into the pocket of my silk blazer and pulled out my phone. I scrolled through my contacts, bypassing the deactivated numbers of my former family members, and tapped the name of my lead general contractor. The line rang twice before he answered. I did not exchange pleasantries. I told him the property was completely vacant and legally secured. I instructed him to mobilize his crew and get his lead architects on site by Monday morning. I told him we were tearing down the interior walls, ripping out the outdated fixtures, and completely restructuring the floor plan. It was time to bring in the heavy machinery and demolish the last remaining traces of my parents' reign. 3 months later, the heavy wrought iron gates of the Kensington Avenue property swung open, but they no longer guarded a mausoleum of toxic secrets. The crisp autumn air had given way to a bright, promising spring. I drove my car up the sweeping circular driveway, the tires crunching satisfyingly against the fresh gravel. I parked directly in front of the grand marble steps, a space previously reserved exclusively for Calvin's imported sports cars. I stepped out, smoothing the lapels of my tailored emerald suit, and looked up at the facade. Structurally, the estate remained the same imposing limestone fortress. Energetically, it was an entirely different universe. I walked through the massive glass double doors that had replaced the heavy oppressive mahogany. The transformation was absolute. The suffocating gaudy wallpaper and ostentatious chandeliers were gone. In their place, the foyer boasted clean, minimalist lines, brilliant white walls, and sleek steel accents. The space buzzed with a vibrant electric energy. The sharp aroma of freshly brewed espresso mingled with the faint scent of expensive leather. This was no longer a monument to my parents' manufactured social standing. This was the headquarters of Apex Holdings. I moved through the main corridor, my heels clicking confidently against the polished marble floor. The former formal dining room where Calvin used to dictate his conditional love and demand absolute obedience had been completely gutted. It was now a state-of-the-art glass-walled conference room. Inside, a team of analysts was deeply engaged in a heated, passionate debate over a corporate merger, projecting dynamic financial models onto a massive smartboard. I paused by the glass watching them work. Every single person in that room and throughout the entire first floor of the estate was a brilliant, highly qualified African American woman. I had actively scouted and poached top-tier talent from across the country. I sought out the women who had been chronically overlooked for promotions, the ones whose ideas were stolen by mediocre male colleagues, the ones who were consistently told they did not quite fit the corporate culture of the established downtown firms. I caught the eye of Maya, my lead forensic accountant, through the glass. Maya possessed 2 master's degrees and had spent a decade running circles around the senior partners at a Big Four firm, only to be passed over for partnership 3 consecutive times. I had offered her full equity, total creative control over her division, and double her previous salary. Maya flashed me a brilliant, confident smile and gave a quick thumbs up before turning back to her team to finalize the absolute destruction of a corrupt hedge fund's fraudulent tax filings. I continued my walk through the open concept bullpens that now occupied the sprawling living areas. There were no hushed whispers here. There was no walking on eggshells to appease a fragile male ego. The air rang with the sound of sharp intellect, fierce ambition, and women closing massive multi-million-dollar deals. I stopped by the desk of Naya, a former junior analyst who had been ignored by Wall Street. I quickly reviewed the risk assessment portfolio she handed me, signed off on her flawless projections, and authorized her to execute the trade. I built Apex Holdings to be a sanctuary for the underestimated, and in just 3 months we were aggressively dominating the financial sector of Atlanta. I ascended the sweeping central staircase heading toward the south wing. Jada's former hoarder den of a master suite, once packed to the ceiling with designer clothes and unchecked entitlement, was now my executive office. The plush, suffocating carpets had been ripped out to expose the original gorgeous hardwood floors. A massive, sleek slate desk sat in the center of the room, offering panoramic views of the manicured gardens below. I set my briefcase down and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The business was thriving beyond my most aggressive projections. The wealthy clients who had frantically abandoned Calvin's crumbling empire after his public humiliation had initially tried to bring their portfolios to Apex Holdings. I rejected every single one of them. I refused to let Brenda and Calvin's toxic social circle infect my clean operation. We ran exhaustive background checks on every prospective client, accepting only clean money and legitimate enterprises. Apex Holdings was untouchable, built on a foundation of absolute transparency and rigorous forensic accounting. A soft chime from the intercom on my desk pulled me from my thoughts. I pressed the silver button connecting to Simone, my fiercely protective receptionist, manning the front desk downstairs. Simone informed me that a highly secure delivery had just arrived at the front gates and the transport supervisor was demanding my direct signature. I locked my computer terminal and headed back downstairs, a rare spark of genuine excitement accelerating my steps. When I reached the foyer, 2 heavy armored transport trucks were idling in the circular driveway. 4 armed private security guards flanked the glass entrance, maintaining a tight perimeter around 3 massive climate-controlled wooden crates. The transport supervisor, a broad-shouldered man in a tactical uniform, stepped forward and handed me a digital tablet. He verified my identity, confirming that the high-security transfer from the downtown municipal vault was complete. I signed the screen with a swift, fluid motion, officially authorizing the release of the cargo. I directed the guards down the eastern hallway, guiding them toward the sprawling sunroom. I had specifically retrofitted the space during the renovations, installing UV, filtered glass, advanced humidity controls, and museum-grade security sensors. The guards carefully unlatched the heavy wooden crates, prying the sides open to reveal the meticulously wrapped contents. As the protective layers were peeled away, The brilliant, vibrant colors of my grandmother Evelyn's vintage art collection were finally exposed to the sunlight. These were the exact masterpieces Julian had so arrogantly attempted to fence to cover his gambling debts. This was the generational wealth Calvin had desperately tried to leverage to save his own sinking ship. Evelyn had known exactly what she was doing when she locked this collection inside an impenetrable blind trust, keeping it entirely out of her son's greedy hands until the inevitable collapse occurred. I stood in the center of the sunroom, watching the guards carefully mount the first breathtaking canvas against the stark white gallery wall. The vibrant brushstrokes brought an undeniable soul back into the estate. The legacy was finally home, legally secured under the Apex Holdings Corporate Trust, and completely permanently untouchable. I stood in the center of the expansive lobby, directing the armed transport crew with precise hand gestures. I pointed toward the focal wall behind the reception desk, instructing the handlers to elevate the heavy canvas exactly 2 inches to the right. The mounting brackets clicked firmly into place. The protective sheeting fell away, revealing the vibrant, sweeping brushstrokes of my grandmother Evelyn's favorite abstract piece. The brilliant blues and golds instantly injected a profound, undeniable soul into the sleek modern architecture of the Apex Holdings headquarters. I stood back, crossing my arms as a wave of immense pride washed over me. I was deliberately honoring the only woman in the Wilson family who had ever truly seen my worth. Evelyn had recognized the ruthless intellect buried beneath my quiet obedience. She had understood that my parents' toxic favoritism would eventually tear the family apart, and she had meticulously armed me with the exact financial weapons required to survive the fallout. I left the installation crew to finish securing the remaining pieces and walked toward the executive break room. I poured a double shot of espresso from the commercial machine, the rich, bitter aroma grounding me in the present reality. Leaning against the polished granite counter, I pulled out my tablet and opened the primary local news portal. The top headline immediately grabbed my attention. It detailed Julian's highly publicized federal indictment for wire fraud, money laundering, and criminal conspiracy. The article featured a high-resolution photograph of my former brother-in-law being escorted down the steps of the federal courthouse in handcuffs. He looked exhausted, terrified, and completely stripped of his arrogant, bespoke armor. I read through the journalistic breakdown of his spectacular collapse. The federal prosecutors had meticulously traced the fraudulent lease agreements, uncovering a massive multi-state Ponzi scheme designed exclusively to funnel investor capital into offshore gambling syndicates. The prosecution was pushing for a 20-year sentence. I scrolled further down the page and found the inevitable secondary headline. Local real estate magnate Calvin Wilson had officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy protection. The article outlined how Calvin's entire portfolio, his pristine country club memberships, and his remaining liquid assets had been completely seized to satisfy the massive, staggering debts he had blindly guaranteed for Julian. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso. I searched my chest for a single ounce of pity, a lingering shred of daughterly guilt, or even a fleeting moment of sorrow. I found absolutely nothing. I felt only a profound, unshakable sense of closure. They had built their entire existence on a foundation of pathological lies, staggering greed, and the systematic abuse of the one person holding their finances together. I had not destroyed them. I had simply stepped out of the way and allowed their own monumental arrogance to pull the trigger. The sharp chime of the intercom interrupted the quiet hum of the break room. Simone's voice came through the speaker, crisp and entirely professional. She informed me that Dr. Vance had just arrived in the lobby. Dr. Vance was the head of the largest medical group in Atlanta, a prominent fixture in my parents' former elite social circle, and one of the men who had sat at the table during Calvin's disastrous country club dinner. I walked out to the lobby expecting a confrontation. I expected him to scold me, to demand leniency for his ruined friend, or to defend the old guard. Instead, Dr. Vance stood respectfully near the newly installed artwork, holding a thick leather briefcase. He turned to face me, his expression devoid of the condescension he used to reserve for Calvin's quiet bookkeeper daughter. He extended his hand explicitly, stating that he had closely followed the eviction case and the subsequent exposure of Julian's fraud. He was not here to defend my father. He was here to formally hire Apex Holdings to conduct a comprehensive forensic audit of his entire medical group's investment portfolios, admitting that if Calvin Wilson could be so easily conned, his own board of directors desperately needed my ruthless exactitude. I shook Dr. Vance's hand, finalizing a lucrative multi-million-dollar contract that cemented Apex Holdings as the premier forensic accounting firm in the state. After personally escorting him out through the glass double doors, I turned and walked toward the south wing of the estate. I stepped into my private executive office, a sprawling sunlit sanctuary that used to be Calvin's dark, forbidden study. For decades, this room had been a terrifying fortress of toxic masculinity. It used to reek of stale cigar smoke, old leather, and oppressive expectations. It was the exact room where Calvin had repeatedly summoned me to demand my total submission, where he had belittled my career choices, and where he had aggressively ordered me to surrender my grandmother's property to his golden child. Now the heavy, suffocating velvet drapes were gone, replaced by sheer panels that allowed bright, unhindered sunlight to flood across the pristine hardwood floors. I walked around the massive custom-built white oak desk that anchored the center of the room and sank into the plush ergonomic chair. I ran my fingers over the smooth, cool surface of the wood, letting the absolute reality of my victory sink into my bones. I reflected on the entire brutal journey that had brought me to this exact chair. I thought about the pouring rain on that Friday night. I thought about the sharp metallic click of my key failing to turn in the guest house lock. Calvin and Brenda had genuinely believed that changing those locks would completely destroy me. They had gleefully anticipated leaving me out in the cold. They wanted me desperate, broken, and crawling back to them begging for the miserable, pathetic scraps of their conditional love. They thought that by stripping away my basic shelter, they would force me to bow to Jada's unchecked entitlement and Julian's staggering greed. Instead, their supreme pathological arrogance had activated a meticulously constructed trap. By attempting to lock me out of a tiny, insignificant guest room, they had legally and financially handed me the absolute keys to my own empire. They had drastically underestimated the quiet scapegoat who had spent a decade memorizing the structural weaknesses of their fraudulent kingdom. They locked me out of a guest room, so I took the whole estate. Justice isn't just blind. Sometimes it comes with a forensic audit and an eviction notice. True family is defined by mutual respect and unwavering support, not merely shared DNA. When toxic relatives use your loyalty as a weapon, walking away isn't an act of betrayal, it's absolute self-preservation. You cannot truly heal in the exact same environment that broke you. By setting firm boundaries and refusing to shrink yourself to fit their false narratives, you reclaim your power. Your worth is never dictated by their conditional approval, but by the beautiful resilience you build from the ashes of their rejection. Please share your own experiences in the comments below about walking away from toxic situations to protect your peace, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more empowering stories.